Chapter 21. Onesimus grew stronger rapidly, and after 4 or 5 days he told Luke, his kindly physician, that he felt he should be moving on and not presume on Mistress Priscilla's hospitality any longer. His money was in safe deposit up at the barracks, and he would pay for his lodging and find other quarters. But first he had a favor to ask. Would Luke take him to visit Paul? Luke was surprised. He had sat daily with this unhappy boy and had spoken to him of Christ, but he had made no response, only moved his head restlessly on the pillow as though reluctant to hear. He did not know that Onesimus was haunted day and night by a burden of guilt that had suddenly become intolerable, and yet, glimpsing the price he would have to pay to get rid of it, hardly dared face up to it. "We will go tomorrow," said Luke, "in the cool of the day. He is imprisoned near the Praetorian barracks." They set out together next evening, Onesimus feeble as an old man and leaning on Luke's arm. Aquila lived in the Jewish quarter on the far side of the Tiber, so they crossed the river together and rested in one of the gardens on the bank. They went on slowly, and about sunset they reached the small house they had come to seek in the shadow of the barracks. "He has many, many visitors," said Luke. "You may have to wait before he can give you an audience." He knocked at the door, and a voice bade him enter. "Is it Luke?" said the tired voice of an old man within. "I am glad you have come. We have a singular joy this evening. Who do you think has arrived to visit us all the way from Phrygia?" Phrygia? Onesimus would have fled, but curiosity kept him rooted to the spot. Luke drew him gently in, and when his eyes became accustomed to the gloom, he saw a sight he would never forget. A man, round-shouldered and small in stature, sat on a stool chained by his wrist to a burly Roman guard who lay full length on the floor, fast asleep. The prisoner was the same Paul he had seen at Ephesus, but infinitely older and frailer, and he peered at the newcomers with dim, scarred eyes, as though he had difficulty in recognizing them. Yet his face was alight with joy as he looked round on the little group of disciples who sat at his feet, and as he laid his hand in loving welcome on the head of the tall, travel-stained newcomer. "Draw near and see for yourself, Luke, how often you have heard me speak of him, my brother in Christ, my beloved Epaphras from Asia." The traveler turned to greet Luke, and as he did so, caught sight of the white-faced young man with the frightened, haunted eyes in the doorway. They remained staring at each other in amazement for a few moments, and then Epaphras spoke. "Can it be?" he said, puzzled. "Were you not for many years in attendance on Philemon's crippled son? I heard you had perished in the Laodicean disaster. How comes it that I find you here?" His voice was stern, and still Onesimus stood silent, rooted to the spot. "Fool!" cried his reason. "Turn and run. There is yet time. Think of the penalties of the runaway slave. Think of those who, for the same crime, here in this city, have been branded, crucified, thrown to the beasts. What are you waiting for?" "Those following feet have all but caught up with you now," said his heart. "You are all but cornered and at bay. Now is your last chance to escape. But if you escape now, you escape forever. And do you really want to escape?" So he stood his ground and answered humbly, "I am he. I escaped with my life and came to Rome. I have suffered many things, and the burden of my guilt has become intolerable, so that I no longer desire life. I have been sick and would rest now, but later on in the evening I pray that Master Paul will speak with me." In truth, his head was swimming, and the color had drained from his face, leaving it ashen gray. He put out his hand to steady himself, and Luke was beside him in an instant. The doctor spread his own cloak on the floor and laid his patient down beside the Roman soldier. Onesimus closed his eyes and knew that this was the end. He was cornered and must turn and face up to the stern demands of love and bow to a new, eternal master. His brief, vain freedom was over. But what these demands would be, he was too tired and weak to think out. He lay very still and at peace and listened to the conversation of the little group, the first news he had received of his home for 2 years. They were speaking of the churches in Hierapolis, Laodicea and Colossus. All prospered, and Philemon and Apphia were well, strong in their love for Christ and for their brethren. Archippus had been sick and depressed, sometimes too tired to fulfill his ministry, yet battling on bravely, and now a joy had been given to him that he had never expected, for a tender attachment had grown up between him and a Christian maiden in Hierapolis. Yet the little church was in danger, and Epaphras' voice was urgent and anxious as he spoke of the heresy that threatened it. There was that young Phrygian who was trying to combine the simplicity of the gospel of Christ with their own pagan beliefs. Christian slaves had been partaking in the strange rites, keeping feasts, fasting till they were pale and weak, and trying to rise by mortification of the flesh and a worship of angels to a gradual, painful knowledge of God. "This heresy is not preached in Philemon's house," said Epaphras, but it has subverted many and even drawn some away who used to gather there. It flatters their intellects and is not far removed from their own beliefs in spirit worship and mysteries. As though Christ were not all in all, murmured the apostle, visibly agitated. I must write them a letter, begging them to beware, showing them again that in Christ dwells all the fullness of God. This is the only mystery they need ever explore. The Roman guard was relieved by a great fierce brute of a man who sat with his back to the wall, scowling and picking his teeth. Paul greeted him courteously, and the talk flowed on, but Onesimus lost the thread. By the light of a smoky lamp he was watching the faces of the little company, urgent and troubled. There was a thin, dedicated-looking young man called Timothy, whose eyes blazed with love as he watched the apostle, and another older man called Epaphroditus, who seemed to be convalescing from a serious illness. A third, with Jewish features, sat humbly in the background and said very little. Probably a servant, thought Onesimus sleepily, and wondered how long they would all go on talking. All night he imagined as another and another joined the group. A sharp-featured man called Demas came in and interrupted their discussion with news of what was happening in Rome. But no one else seemed very interested, and the talk veered back to heresy in the churches until a brother called Tychicus arrived. He had been preaching to a group of Christians in another district of Rome and seemed encouraged. We were a mixed company tonight, he said in a low voice, so as not to wake the soldier who was snoring loudly. Slaves, Jews, a few of Caesar's household, 2 or 3 from the guard, high and low, Jew and Gentile, all one in Christ Jesus. But Aristobulus, who sees Nero almost daily, thinks that the storm will soon break in good earnest, and that it is no longer safe to gather in private homes. He thinks we should find a more secret. Demas kicked him, and he broke off and looked around. He had not seen the stranger lying, apparently asleep, under the cloak in the shadows of the room. Onesimus, opening an eye, saw him stoop and trace that mysterious sign on the floor, and saw the others shake their heads. It was very late now. The company knelt round the dying lamp, and Paul prayed long and lovingly for the flock of God in Rome, in Greece, in Asia, for those threatened by ravening wolves in Colossus, for the burdened sinners sleeping on the floor. He blessed them as a father, and one by one they went off into the night, all except Timothy, who stayed and brought the old man food and drink, and would have settled him as comfortably as his chain would allow. Are you going to sleep, my father? I think not, my son. I would speak with that boy who came tonight. If he is not asleep, bring him to sup with us. I am not asleep, said Onesimus. He felt rested and ready to talk. He joined Paul and Timothy at their humble meal, and then, down on the dark floor, with his face hidden, he told the apostle all: his hatred of Archippus, his revenge at Ephesus, the years of theft, the culminating robbery and flight at Laodicea, the killing of his friend in the arena, and his final terror of death. Once he started, he felt he could never stop. All that had been locked in his angry, resentful, unhappy heart came flowing out that night like a black flood. Weary, Timothy lay down and slept, but Paul and Onesimus talked on. Was there hope? Was there forgiveness? Would Christ yet have mercy in spite of the years of refusal and that determination to be free that had brought him so low? He asked these questions again and again, and Paul spoke to him long and earnestly about the cross of Christ and all that it offered him. He can blot out that record of sin that is against you, said Paul. He can take it out of the way as though it were nailed to his cross. Justified by faith, and you can have peace with God. I know. I have trodden this path. I saw Stephen the martyr die, and I consented and guarded the clothes of those who stoned him. I knew that torment of conscience, but I will tell you, too, how I saw Christ. It was almost morning when Paul finished that story. Onesimus listened entranced. Truly, how hard, how very hard it had been to kick against the pricks. The guard stirred in his sleep. Onesimus lifted his eyes and saw the dawn stealing in through the bars of that prison room, and felt as though he had been born again, a little child in a fair new world. The burden had been lifted forever, and in the joy of sin forgiven, he had barely, as yet, given a thought to the next step. Enough, for the moment, that he had come to Christ and Christ had received him. Yet deep down in his broken, happy heart lurked the question that Paul had asked on the Damascus road. Soon he must ask it too, and find out the answer. Lord, what wilt thou have me to do?